In a previous conversation on this show, guest Kyle Majchrowski said something I haven't been able to stop thinking about since. He said, "We give imposter syndrome a lot of lip service. Culturally, we don't give people the ability to overcome it openly." And that's the gap this episode is about. Not a gap in process, not a gap in technology, a gap between the work people do and the way they're trained to describe it. The people building the most complex programs in the world, talking themselves down in the room where they have the answer. Today, we're going to do something about that. Welcome to Wired to Build, the podcast exploring how owners, operators, and builders navigate the systems, decisions, and realities shaping the built environment. I'm your host, Nick Caravella, and as always, I'm glad you're here because this show isn't about chasing tools or buzzwords. It's about understanding how work actually gets done, where it breaks down, and what it takes to build with clarity at scale. So whether you're an owner, a builder, or someone living in the space in between, you're in the right place. Let's get wired to build. Before we dive in, I want to acknowledge our founding sponsor, Avocado. Avocado partners with owners and delivery teams on complex capital programs to help them make technology work, aligning strategy, implementation, and real-world execution across the full project lifecycle. If you're investing in construction technology, digital delivery, or data initiatives, and struggling to turn those investments into real outcomes, Avocado helps teams move from intention to impact. You can learn more at avocado.com. There's a habit in this industry that doesn't get named very often. Capable people. People close to hard work, people who have earned the room, describing themselves as just something. Just a PM, just an owner's rep, just an BD. I've done it. You've probably done it. And today we're going to talk about where that comes from, what it costs, and what it looks like to stop. To help us dig into this, I've joined by two people I've gotten to know through Ripple Intent, a community that has been creating space for exactly these kinds of conversations for years. Kyle Majchrowski has spent his career on the owner side of complex capital programs and has spent the better part of a decade studying the conversations that never make it onto the agenda. He's written 2 books about it, and we're using the second one today. Megan Schroeder does business development for Degenkolb Engineers, a structural engineering firm, which means she lives every day in the space between what a deeply technical team delivers and how the world lets them talk about it. Kyle and Megan, great to have you both here.
Thanks for having us. Good to be back.
I'm excited to have a conversation with you both.
Yeah. So Kyle, welcome back. Excited that you've published your second book on powerful conversations, how to talk about what matters most in work and life. And I'll have to ask, what got you to write volume 2? What was left unsaid?
That's a good question. So clearly there was enough left unsaid that I was able to compile a second book. There's a third one that will be coming out down the road because there are just a lot of topics that allow people to truly have a powerful conversation and engage a lot of things that we take for granted and assume that we know.
So a third book is in the works. Is there an opportunity to peek at what may be coming in that focus for that volume?
Yeah. So there's a couple of them actually that are in the process. Taking a break from the whole powerful conversation series, and that third one will come out down the road. But right now, the focus is on the process of what actually happens within these 2 books and happens in our various events, where we are actually going through a very thoughtful and intentional process that allows people to connect, to connections to take place between 2 human beings within whatever context it is that we're talking about. So articulating, pulling apart, dissecting, understanding what goes on in that process, and then how people can easily, quickly, and often replicate that to increase the amount of connection in their own lives.
And I'm glad you kind of teed it up that way, because the second part of this episode, we're going to model a little bit of that and talk about this topic of success. And while it's not a specific chapter in the volume, it's something that during the pre-call we wanted to lock into because it touches all of those things, those feelings of anxiety and ego and sacrifice and courage and all the different kinds of topics you talk about. I guess why success? And when success comes up in a room like Ripple Intent, what are the things that people are saying that they maybe don't always quite get to?
I'm gonna let Megan answer that one.
Well, I think one of the things that makes it really hard is I think that we all think what we're doing is just what we're doing. Like it's how you're living, you're doing your job. Like I hear often from engineers like, oh, but every engineer does that. I'm like, maybe not. So I think that devaluing comes really quickly before we want to allow ourselves to have success. And I also think something that can come up is like people, if you achieve success, then where are you going to go next, right? Like if we check the box, then maybe it feels like we don't have anywhere to go from there. So that's some of my thoughts.
Well, I think that's interesting too, your response, because, and we got to let the audience get to know you a little bit better. But we were talking about how you came from Kansas City and then moved out to California, working for a structural engineer firm, which in California is historically in the healthcare space probably one of the hardest places to do structural or any kind of design for that matter. So tell me a little bit about your path and what you've experienced as you've shifted from roles in marketing to becoming closer and closer to the construction space.
Yeah. So I guess for me, it starts the kind of through line for all of this is I've always been really passionate about people. I love people. I think everyone's really interesting and just since I was a kid, like I've loved people. So that led me to just a very confusing path of going to college for business because that seems like a broad enough thing that I can kind of love people doing business and then going to WeWork, and then bouncing into the engineering space, and then coming out to California, knowing throughout that time that I was doing marketing that I wanted to really kind of hone in on business development specifically because it gave me the best opportunity, in my opinion, to get to celebrate the work that everyone in this industry was doing and connect people in the industry to do more awesome work together. And so I was able to convince Degenkolb to allow me to try to do that. And in California, as you mentioned, structural engineering can be very challenging in the healthcare space. And so I had no idea when I moved to San Diego that that was the case. I had never heard of HCAI. And so getting to learn a little bit about that and learn how awesome my team is and celebrate them, and try to help them celebrate themselves and connect has just been like it's been the love of people played out in my early career.
And I love that you said the word celebrate. And I think it's a good way to turn it back to Kyle and a little bit about Ripple Intent, because to me, it is, at least my experience within Ripple Intent has been about celebrating the people within it. And so for those who haven't listened to Kyle's first episode with Kyle, you want to share a little bit about your background, what Ripple Intent is, and maybe how this celebration idea might fit into the ethos of that community?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been, like you said, in the introduction, I've been on the owner side for over 20 years. Academic medical center, healthcare, private development. So I've seen a lot of angles of the AEC industry. And at one point, I took over a group that was really disengaged and just kind of burnt out. But they accepted this as the norm in the organization in which they worked because it was so difficult to deliver work. And so they just, they were okay with over budget. They were okay with busted schedules. And you just kind of came to work and did what you could and hoped for the best. And went on this journey to try to improve that. Took all the efficiency and effectiveness and process approach, and that got me absolutely nowhere, and that was really confusing. And so problem that I was redirected to look at was the people. And I thought, well, everywhere has people, so maybe we should get some people together and talk about people. And we did. Surprisingly, people were interested in this. Other owners from around the area came together and we talked about the people problems we had. And when we were finished, people said, hey, that was really cool, can we do it again? And that was Ripple Intent. That's how it became a thing. And so now we do monthly breakfast clubs in about 15 cities around the country. And we use the time together once a month to talk about a topic that most of us either take for granted or assume that we know. And we use that topic to, again, go back to the connection piece, to build relationships, open connections, and help overall the industry better itself by focusing on the individual people.
Yeah. And so, Megan, when you brought up this topic about success and how people present themselves, I'm curious, Kyle, what did you hear in that and what got you excited about digging into what we're going to be digging into on the next episode?
Well, like we do in all of our conversations, in the book, in Ripple Intent, you name it, we take a topic. So when Megan said, "Hey, what if we discussed success?" Immediately what goes through my head is, "Hey, what do I know about success? What do I believe success to be? What's the definition? How do I see it myself? How do I see it in others? How do I see it in my work?" And on and on. So all these questions start flooding through. And for some people are like, all she said was success. Why are you making it so complicated? And the reality is, it's actually, as we're going to find out, it actually is really, really complicated. And so when we pause and take the time to dig into what do we know? What are our assumptions? What are our biases? What are our judgments? What's going inside? What influenced how we got to where we are, what we know about these things in our head? And then how does it show up in our life day to day? And then how can we help other people increase their own self awareness, become better, and connect better because of this awareness or this understanding of a simple term like success? I actually got pretty excited, like you can hear right now. This is going to be a fun conversation to unpack because success, it should be, it's kind of like humility. It's like, I know what it is. Let's go. And it's like, okay, we'll see where it's a cool topic. And to spend some time peeling it apart and talking through, I think it's going to be a really good example of what we do.
Yeah, and it is like I'm just thinking back on the episode about curiosity where we ended up spending about 50 minutes plus talking about just that one word, and I'm curious, where we're going to get to with this because success means a lot of things to a lot of people. Uh, and not only does it mean a lot of things to a lot of people, that a lot of people have opinions about what it means for an individual as well. And so I can't wait to kind of dig into what that means because I look at things that I'm doing in my space, whether it is this podcast, whether it is my work, and people have a lot of advice sometimes about where the show should go or where my work should go and what I should do. And it's oftentimes I have to step back and say, that might be the definition someone might have for success for this idea, but that doesn't need to be my definition for it either. And being able to free yourself from the definitions that get thrown at you, to me, is an important way of owning that success journey. And so, Megan, when you brought this topic up, what were some of the things that you might think we're going to get into? And how has Ripple Intent helped you start to explore ideas like this?
I think similar to Kyle's story of how he kind of figured out that he wasn't going to engineer and process his way through difficult projects, that he actually had to people his way through those projects. I think that's kind of part the same thing, right? Like, I think sometimes we think on projects that the complicated things are going to be coming in on time and on budget and all that. And then the reality is the complicated things are the people and these exact things of how do you stay on a project? What does success mean? Is it just if we come in on time and on budget? Or, we hear a lot of people say, like, is it that at the end of the project, you want to have a beer with the people that you did the project with? And it gets a little more complicated. And that's kind of all of these topics. And I think through Ripple Intent, we're starting to really find more people that want to have those conversations throughout the RFQ, RFP process, and then continue to have those conversations throughout projects to create really successful projects from a number of different measures, but putting those measures to more than just some of the, I guess, more traditional measures of success. And then I think that leads into more of the personal side as well, where, okay, if I job hopped for 5 years before I found the right fit, does that mean I'm not a successful employee? If I, don't own a home, does that mean I'm not a successful like member of society or something? That's really dramatic for home ownership. But the personal side of it is really interesting how that comes in and can show up in the small things in life too.
Yeah, and Kyle, I'm curious too, because you're coming from the owner side and the peopling through people, which is a funny way to put the words to it. But I know you've always experimented with what are those metrics, and I like the idea of like a good project being where all the teams kind of want to get together and either share that beer, share some water together if you're not a drinker. But what are some of the maybe atypical or not unexpected, perhaps, metrics that you started to use or experiment with in hopes to help the people better?
Yeah, the early ones, back in the day when all this started, and we actually could say like soft skills without being shunned. It was along those lines. Let's be friends at the end of this. Let's not end this project in lawsuits, anger, frustration, all that kind of stuff. So it was like, all right, the bar's pretty low. Maybe a target is let's be mediocre to each other at the end of this thing. Yay, target. It's grown. You can go a couple different directions. I mean, most of the time, the project team comes up with things like, iconic building and collaborative spaces, and it's usually attributes of whatever it is that you're trying to build. What we don't always do is say, what are the project team delivery experience goals? And that's really what we're talking about. So for the people who are tasked with spending a whole bunch of money on something for a long period of time, when this thing's all said and done, what do you want to look back and say, besides the thing that was created, what do we want? And some of those, and they were all over the place. And at one point, you start talking about, we want some team members to leave, not because they're bad team members, but because they've grown, they've expanded, and now they've been promoted and they've been poached to another firm, or they can go do bigger and better things. That's an awesome metric of success. Not for everybody. Some people are like, no, I want everyone to stay in their slot. And for the next 5 years, this is what we're going to do. So growth, development, some of them were talk about growth. There were a couple that have raised their hand and talked about work-life balance. They talked about maybe collectively we should lose weight, or we should reduce the team's overall blood pressure during the delivery of this project. I know that's, you talk about transparency and vulnerability here. But when you get that serious about what are we going to do to better the lives of the people working on this project, that's some of the stuff that starts coming out.
Yeah, and it's one thing I've been privileged enough to get to start to experience now that I've moved to Cumulus, which is much more of a field-driven product and getting to know people. As I've walked through a lot of active sites and even some integrator fabrication type sites, and started to attend like the risk and safety meetings. And that's somewhere where I've started to see where the people side of the industry takes shape, because they go through some simple questions like, where's your mind at today? Or why are you working this week? And you go to a site in the holidays and everybody's either got like Christmas presents for my kids, like all these things up on the board. And it's a very cool way that I don't think I ever got to experience in the architecture office, where we just kind of, go and punch the clock, do the design thing, and then go home. But really thinking about, what's the ball people's eyes are on, and why are they here, and what are they thinking about? And, is a family member sick, or does a kid need that new PlayStation? Or these are things that make us human and make us go to work, not just because sometimes it is just a job. And being able to get to know the people who are doing that is a really great way to understand not everybody cares about these projects for the same reasons. And I think there's a whole lot of connection we can build around understanding what that means.
Yes. And more so than just, hey, what kind of pizza do you like? Let's go around the
Yeah.
room. Yay, we're connected. Moving on. It's way more complicated than that. And when it works, it's pretty awesome.
So, Megan, you mentioned working at WeWork, then coming over into the structural engineering space. And I think marketing's probably taught you a lot about people in that experience. What are things that you've perhaps observed about the different types of people, especially as like those are very different markets, or WeWork is trying to do co-working space for, it's really more B2C type expertise. And then you have more of a B2B type world, I imagine, with the healthcare space. So how has that made you think about the way you talk with people and meet them where they're at? And what are some of those differences and similarities you see?
Good question. I think we work, and sometimes within like a B2C space, you assume that it's like a one-time interaction or a quick interaction, and that's what can lead to your sale. But then WeWork specifically was a little bit different, because then we saw those people again because they were now like members, right? So that kind of membership became, you couldn't be kind of a quote unquote fake salesperson at the beginning, kind of hook them and then become a different person. Like, because you're gonna see them the next day. I saw all of those members every day for coffee. And so I sat down with them every day for coffee. And part of my job was to help the members connect to each other. So I got to dive into that in a fairly safe way, because they had already kind of purchased the product. And then I was just saying, hey, let's meet, let's all get together for coffee, let's all go to this thing together, this discussion together, different things like that. So it was a little bit safer way to start to understand how important connection was for people. And then coming over to the business development side of engineering, the connection is still the main driver. It just happens sooner. And I think where I see a lot of success and where I have felt a lot of success for myself is if you can make that connection and not be transactional about it, right? Like being able to really connect from the beginning, hold on to that through a pursuit and then also continuing on through a project, which I think is sometimes that where business development might not be, some firms might not include them in the actual project completion type of part of the project, but I think it's really important and really valuable. I think something else that comes up for me with this topic for business development is I've heard people say, I hate losing more than I like winning. And I think that can be really hard to actually find success if you're just focused on the losses. If you're just focused on like the worst thing that can happen is we lose. And like maybe the worst thing that can happen is that you don't try uh to win it. Like or maybe the worst thing that can happen to Kyle's point is that we all leave even a pursuit and we hate each other. But if just winning the project is the goal, then I think that can lead to honestly burnout because your success is not going to feel as meaningful and fulfilling as the loss is going to potentially hurt you and kind of weigh on you.
Yeah, wow. I'm just want to like sit there with the hating losing more than winning a little bit because especially in having grown into a BD role myself, like losing is so much part of like you have to get up, you have to swing, and you're going to strike out occasionally if not often. And it's important to do that because losing is where learning is done. It's harder to look back after a win and be like, well, how did everything go right? Well, everything that happened was supposed to happen. And like, you kind of just become patting on your back. And then when there's a loss, there is at least a deep responsibility of accountability, not just within like oneself, but like across the team and across even the customer of understanding maybe we didn't meet them or where they're at. There's so much more, I guess, humanness to a loss that forces you to like, at least me when I'm going through any form of loss, think about why I'm feeling the way I'm feeling and what may have led up to it. And maybe it's not even my fault. And having to have acceptance over the lack of control over things, that just is really powerful. And oftentimes I would tell people it's like I'm more interested in the losses than I am in the wins because the losses tell us a lot more. When did you kind of get that aha? Was it in observing where projects were going wrong and perhaps what led up to them? What were some of the things that you saw on, struggling projects versus successful projects that led you to kind of understand what the culture of success could look like for a project team?
Yeah, I think the one of the very first things was, like you're saying, Megan, the people side of it. It depends how you were brought up, depends how you were raised as to what success really meant. And on a project, especially through school and early in the career, I mean, like you mentioned, the budget, the schedule, the scope, get those things and check success. But what became apparent was, especially when you're in a serial situation where you're in a portfolio or a program of projects. So when you're running hundreds or thousands of projects within your team for a year or within a year, then the repeatability becomes very, very important. And if everyone's burning the candle at both ends to make one project succeed, then that project ends and everyone says, oh, thank God. And they're exhausted and they're done and they're burnt out and they're ready to just, and no, you've got 999 to go. And they just keep coming. And so you can't realistically expect people to give 110% all the time, every single day in perpetuity. That's a ridiculous expectation unless you're applying for a job. You're applying for a job, then of course that's what you do. But when you're actually working or leading a team, you have to understand that people are people. They get tired. They have a lot of work to do. They need to rest. They need to recharge, and they have to be respected when it comes to how do we do. So, you give them all the things that you're supposed to. You got to give them the tools. You got to give them the time, the resources, all those things that they need in order to function and do their jobs well. And then on top of that, there's a whole bunch of other stuff that has to be in place in order for projects to actually to continue to be successful.
And that's where I think, we're like touching the topic left and right, and I don't want to jump into it too far. I'm trying to maintain some discipline here so we can talk around it. But I do want to kind of, zoom into perhaps a moment where you've caught yourself underselling yourself. And is there a moment either in recent times, early in your career, at some point where you found yourself describing you as like just an engineer or just an owner rep? Or tell me more about that moment if you have one in mind. And looking back on it now, how do you build empathy for that moment in your journey? And grace for where you were at that time.
Nah, I'm not going to talk about myself. Because the reason is there's a fresh story in my mind of a wonderful person who so we're going about our business, and all of a sudden there's a project manager on the team who says I'm leaving. I'm quitting. It was a surprise to most people. And so I was the boss, and they told me that. And my very, very, very first reaction was to say, okay, and get up and walk over to this other person, go in her office, close the door, and say, hey, guess what? So and so just told me they're leaving. You're going to apply for the job, right? She looked at me deadpan and said, absolutely not. And I was like, you sure? And she goes, hell no. No. Nope. I said, okay, I'll be back. So I went and I talked to our team, and I talked to vendors who knew this person, and I got some input. And then I went back to her a couple of days later and I said, hey, that position. She goes, I'm still not applying for it. And I go, well, let me share. Our team said you should. The people that you work with say you should. And our other people outside of our team, but within our organization, also said they got your back and you should apply for this. And she goes, well, gosh darn it, if all those people said all those nice things about me, I guess I have to apply. And I really felt she was mostly annoyed, but partly like, okay, I'll try it. But I really think it was mostly annoyed. And so here's a situation where you literally had dozens, probably 40 plus people who said this person should go for the job, even after she was adamant, no, I should not go for the job. She got the job, by the way.
That's incredible. And there's something personal that I've used because in many times I remember getting my first speaking opportunity at a conference, and you get so in your head. At least I did at my first and probably my first 15 speaking opportunities. You get so in my head of like, why me? I'm too young for this. I don't have that much experience. All of the things that like start to shout in your head when you start to prove how much you can do. And now, having the blessing that I've been at bat so many times, I remember when people are getting their first swing at these things, and I try to remind them what I was reminded is that you wouldn't have the opportunity if you weren't qualified for it, and you wouldn't have been selected to speak if people didn't believe you could, or you wouldn't be like in this instance of the project manager you're talking about, like people believe that individual could raise to that occasion. And it didn't matter so much what the voice in our head was telling us. It was that the people around us believed in us. And so maybe as a way to close this introduction and leave our audience with something to be thinking about is, you know, what are ways that you've seen or heard of other people inspiring other people? And how can we encourage people to show up for each other more so that we can do bigger things together?
Before
I'll
we
leave
go
that.
into
Yeah.
that,
Yeah. Go ahead.
before we go there, I also want to acknowledge and maybe add to that nugget. You mentioned having empathy for that part of you that like is saying you can't or saying you didn't do good enough. And I think a big piece of that is this self-preservation and this protection, right? Because you're saying, "Oh, I'm too young for this. I'm not qualified. I'm just BD," because it can be scary to head into the unknown. And so I think that's kind of that piece of acknowledging and being grateful to yourself. Hey, like this is probably going to get a little too woo woo for Kyle, but like being able to say, Megan, I know you're trying to keep me safe when you're telling me I can't do this, but it's okay. We are safe and we are going to go do this. We're going to go try. So that's my last little nugget.
That's not too
Uh,
woo woo. What are you talking
yeah.
about?
Okay.
Now, goal for the next episode is to get woo woo enough for Kyle. So as we start to wrap, I know like your second should I call it a volume or should I call it a book? I guess it's one and the same, but the second volume you have on Powerful Conversations gets into a lot of things. But I think the what matters the most, at least for me, and what I've gotten from it is really just your methodology around examining what we're going to talk about, why we're talking about it, and how we feel around it. These volumes, these books are written around kind of the exercise that needs to be done in repetition. It's got that Goosebumps theme of pick the chapter that speaks to you most and dive right in, which I love. And so, as someone gets into one of these exercises, what should someone expect to feel going into that? And how do we set ourselves up with, I guess, the right, vulnerable mindset to make sure we're examining these topics well? Because I want everybody to understand when we get into the next episode, how deep into these topics we're going to get and what is kind of the framing around how we question and how we examine these words to be.
You make it sound like therapy. Like you have to go through this mental exercise in order to prepare yourself to expose yourself to the world.
Yeah, well, you know what? Maybe I do. I think there's been a long history of whether therapy is a good or a bad thing, and I think there's a lot of ways to feel about it. But I do think that maybe I more mean an honesty that we need to approach the conversation with, because if we're not putting in our true and honest selves into these conversations, then I don't think we're going to get out as much as we can.
That's fair. So the good thing is, like you said, is it a process? And when you go through any one of the 20 plus topics in either book, the process actually guides you. And what I mean by that is it doesn't start off with tell me about your mother. We don't jump into that right away for good reason, because that's like, no, that's most people's reaction. And so instead, we start off with easy questions that usually can't get wrong. You can't get wrong. So if you think the success, if we get into a conversation around success, it's not going to start with a very complicated, deep. We got to work up to that. So instead, we'll start off with something like, well, let's define success. What does success mean to you? What success have you experienced in the past? Whether it's work, life, ran a race, did a 5K, you were on a high school team, whatever it may have been. So where have you found success? So get some examples out there. These are the opening questions that get you warmed up and really thinking about and examining your own exposure, understanding, and how you form whatever it is that you believe to be what's in this case success. So each one of them starts that way and gets you primed. It really forces you to go into your head and understand and take a look at what you think, and then you start moving towards some of those more complicated questions and some of the more complicated parts of the conversation. But you really can't get the first part wrong unless you answered like, well, define success, and you go porcupine. Like, what? That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So most people are going to answer in a here's what I think, here's what I feel way with the beginning parts of the conversation, which is what we'll do as well.
Awesome. Well, Kyle and Megan, thank you. This has already been the kind of conversation I hoped it'd be. And for everyone listening, part 2 is going to drop in 2 weeks. Kyle's going to lead us through this exercise, and I'll be a participant the same way Megan is. So I genuinely do not know where that episode's going to go, and that's the point. So until then, stay wired to build, and thank you for tuning in.